I'm an 18-year-old male, and I moved from my hometown in with my mum about a year ago now, into a farmhouse pretty much in the middle of nowhere, on the east side of Australia. It was at the very end of a 7-kilometer long driveway that had 2 other houses on it, both with elderly couples in them, and a 30-minute drive away from the nearest town, which is very small, with only 1,000 inhabitants. I'd feel really uncomfortable some nights when I was outside having a cigarette. The old feel like you're being watched feeling. And occasionally would wake up to hear footsteps outside, and I'm sure they didn't sound like the sheep and rams that were near our place. I have a history of drug abuse, and I'm quite paranoid because of it, so I tried to rationalize it by telling myself I was being paranoid. One night, I awoke at 3 a.m. and needed to take a leak. When I looked out my bedroom window, and very briefly see a flash of light, like it had come off a torch on a phone. Seeing as though we live in the middle of nowhere, this freaked me out a lot, and I stayed up until morning listening and looking out but hearing nothing. Maybe a week later, my dad wants to cut the grass. He hops on the lawnmower to realize its tires are slashed, which he blamed on me. But I didn't care because it's just further enforcing the idea that there was someone lurking around in the property. My mum knew I wouldn't do anything like that, and instead thought the neighbor had done it. I always chatted with the neighbor when I went for walks, and I liked him and really doubted he could have done it, let alone be able to walk that far as he was quite old, and if he came in a vehicle late at night, we all would have heard it. My stepdad ended up moving out, because he's a drinker, and I witnessed him on the verge of being violent with my mum and intervened. So he moved out next day, and we haven't seen him since, thankfully. With him gone, and it only being me, my mum, and my 3-year-old sister there, and considering we can't legally own a gun in Australia, and the cops taking a good hour to get here if we needed them, I got increasingly paranoid about the things that had been going on, because I felt I had to be protective. Some nights I would stay up very late, and before going to sleep would turn off all the lights and walk around silently, looking around the windows for any sign. And sure enough, on a few occasions, I would see torches way off in the distance in the middle of the cow paddocks, as if someone saw all the house lights turn off and started to make their way over at 3 a.m. Which is weird to say the least, considering that in every direction, other than towards the other houses on our road, there was absolutely nothing but bush and paddocks for a good 20 kilometers. I should add that our front door didn't properly lock and should easily be opened by just messing with the handle a bit. So I started putting a wheelbarrow up against the door and a metal sheet behind the wheelbarrow, so if the door opened it would make a very loud noise that would definitely wake me up. A few weeks went by, and I saw and heard absolutely nothing, so I began to get much less paranoid and was thinking about it a lot less. One night, I had gotten back from the pub and was still a bit drunk on my phone in the lounge room. All the lights were off because my mum and sister were asleep, and I was just laying there texting and listening to music. We have 2 cats, and on this night they were frisky and running around wildly. So when I heard the metal sheet, I figured it was just the cats and ignored it, then walked straight past it to my room maybe a half hour later, not giving it a second glance. The next morning my paranoia immediately came back in full swing, and I proceeded to freak out when I saw that not only had the sheet fallen over, the door itself was ajar and the wheelbarrow had been moved a good 6 inches as well. There's no way in hell one of my cats could have done that. The only explanation I have for this is that somebody tried to let themselves in, heard the bang, and ran off. A few nights after this, my mum woke me up late, maybe 4 a.m, to ask me to come out to her car with her, because all of her car lights were on and she didn't want to go out by herself. We went out, turned off all the lights, and brought the keys back, which we usually just leave in the car with us inside. The car battery was dead, and we had to get our neighbor to come down with jumper cables the next day. She certainly didn't want any of the lights on, and all of the doors were shut, meaning somebody went inside, pressed the button on the roof, put the keys in the ignition on the accessories, and exited and closed the door, with what we think was the intention of draining the battery. She began agreeing with me that somebody was lurking around the house, and told me a few things she had noticed that she didn't want to tell me because I was already anxious and didn't want to put me more on edge. Like when the tank water started tasting funny, and she found a half-decomposing possum on the grate on top of the tank. She didn't mention how she couldn't possibly see how it could have ended up there, unless it happened to die right there on that exact spot, and somehow didn't start making the water taste funny until it was decomposed so you could see its bones, and how a garden rock was moved in a weird position right outside her window, as if someone was using it to stand on to look inside. The house closest to the road had multiple dogs, and the one that I was friendly with, who lived closer, maybe 3 kilometers from us, had a gun, and often shot rabbits and foxes, so that definitely made us the easiest target. All of this made both of us very concerned, and we ended up finding a house and moving about a month later. I know this is anticlimactic, but it still freaks me the hell out, and I can't think of any other explanation than someone lurking around our house for multiple months. There were many times when no one was home all day, and if they wanted to steal from us, they could have easily come in and taken all our stuff, but nothing was ever missing. Might just be overthinking it, but I truly think they had some very sinister intentions and were intentionally messing with us. My fiancé and I are hugely into camping. This particular season, where the incident happened, we discovered the perfect little hideaway clearing way out in the Crown Land, about an hour west/north of Cremona. We had made about 6 trips out there already, some with large groups of friends and some with just a couple of us, so we were starting to become quite familiar with the area we were exploring. This specific trip was a bigger one. We had about 10 people with us, one of whom is my lifelong best friend of 18 years. To add a little bit of context to this, my best friend and I strongly believe in extraterrestrials and paranormal events. So much so that we successfully signaled a UFO on a beach when we were 12. But that's a story for another time. My best friend and I, Kaylee, were talking about the UFO on the beach around the campfire with everyone. A choice few people were more interested than others. 5 of us decided it would be a really cool and super smart idea to try signaling something again. Before, we used a flashlight to create a specific pattern of flashes into the sky, so why not try again? I remembered the pattern, and after all, we grabbed a few flashlights, laid down near the beach, and began flashing lights into the sky. The first few minutes consisted of nothing but our half-inebriated giggles, but then Kaylee spoke up and asked if we were seeing what she was. We all focused hard on the sky, and lo and behold, there was a flickering light twice as prominent as the other stars, even Venus. I staggered in all directions for a few seconds, before setting on a steady trail over the tree line until we couldn't see it anymore. Thoroughly spooked, we jogged back to camp to tell everyone else what happened. Of course, most of them brushed it off as us acting like little drunks, but we all saw the exact same thing. Strange lights in the sky forgotten, we spent the next few hours around the fire with everyone. One of the more skeptical guys in the group went off to pee, but stopped right at the entrance to the clearing and said something along the lines of, what is that?" which caused the rest of us to see what he was looking at. Just a quick pause to set the scene. Our clearing that we camped in is smaller, only about 30 feet, set back into a tree line roughly 15 to 20 yards from the dirt road that runs through the crown land. Directly across the road from our spot is a small river backing out onto the thick forest and low mountains for miles. When we got to the entrance, we saw a massive, brilliant spotlight shining over the highest mountain peak across the road. It almost looked like the sunrise, except it was 1 a.m. and entirely in the wrong direction. Someone's immediate reaction was to say it was a truck, but that was quickly discounted, because we knew the roads and the trails around there, and they certainly didn't go up the mountain. Another theory was that it might have been a combine, since there are plenty of farms around the area. More likely, except this light was so big it looked like the source would have had to have been as big as a medium-sized yacht. As we were arguing about the possibilities, the light started to slowly beam across the mountaintop, like it was moving sideways. Definitely not a combine. The light would have had to have pointed in the direction it was moving instead of focusing on our direction the whole time, just slowly riding left and right. We all started staring at it in awe, at this weird light for about 10 more seconds, until it darted back across the ridge to its original position, all the while still shining towards us. It moved way too fast for a vehicle or farm equipment, and we no longer had any theories of what it was coming from. A very few short seconds after it stopped, it faded away so slowly you couldn't even tell it was dimming unless you looked away for a second or two. Eventually it disappeared completely. Thoroughly creeped out and chilled to the bone from the early September weather, we quickly made our way back to the fire. None of us can explain the light we saw that night, but it definitely left us all with a very uneasy feeling. I had nightmares the remaining 2 nights we were there, but there were no more unexplainable events after that. This story happened during my teenage years. I lived in a small town of 2,000 people, mainly surrounded by boreal forest in Canada. This place was great, as we often saw deers, and it was usually a quiet and safe place. To put a bit of context, my house was located at the side of a dead end, and the only light source at night was my house. There was a single street light at the end of the road, but it only lighted up a part of the street and the forest behind it. We were a dog family. I only had small dogs when I lived there. Every day, we needed to let them out to pee, as all dogs do. But at night, they were almost impossible to see because of the darkness. Our terrain was kind of big, and the light sources were weak. I was a gamer at that time, and often stayed up late, so I was the one who needed to take out the dog to pee at 2 a.m. because it stayed with me while I was playing. One night, I opened the door and waited for my dog to do his thing. While trying to look at it, I was only able to see the reflection on the light in its eyes when it looked at me. I started to look around, because there were sometimes deer sleeping in the wood, under the streetlights perhaps, or wild turkeys roaming around, when a little dark spot caught my attention. It looked like a human head emerging from the bushes, but I wasn't able to see it because it was a bit in the dark. I didn't want my dog to run after whatever it was, as it had a tendency to run after wild animals, so I called it. It didn't listen to me, but the thing in the bushes started to crawl towards the street slowly. It looked like a human, with thin limbs, but a normal body and a slightly long neck. I started to freak out a bit, and shook the treats cup so my dog would hurry. It came inside running, and I shut the door as fast as I could, closed the lights in my house so I could have a view of what was outside. The strange animal crawled fast, almost running like a dog with every limb broken. As it improvised a crawling movement, the animal passed under the light, where I saw it had no fur. as a shaved animal. It was disgusting. I was afraid and standing in the dark. The animal ran towards the light and continued on the street where I wasn't able to see it because the houses in my neighborhood were delimited by trees. I locked the door and went to sleep with my dog and spoke to no one about it. A few months later, I went to bed early at 11 p.m. and went to watch some videos on my phone. They were gaming videos, and I had earphones on. A sound on the video was recurring, and I thought it was annoying, like a distant weird scream. After the video finished, I went to see another, but during the loading, the sound occurred. I removed my earphones and waited for the sound, and heard it, and had tears in my eyes. It was coming from my window. My room is on the second floor. I looked down into the forest. If there was some movement, the only light near the forest entrance was the moonlight, and an underwater light in our pool that emitted a small halo around it. I wasn't able to see anything, but the sound occurred again. It was like a mix between a distorted scream and a pig having its throat slit, or a strong pain whining from a dog. I looked down and saw an animal that passed so fast it was very hard to see, but it was human-sized with limbs crawling like a spider. It wasn't running after anything, but the sound occurred another time. It was the most horrible thing I'd ever heard. I closed my window to choke a bit of the sonority of it. I heard it again 3 other times, and it stopped after that. I spoke to my dad about the sound, and he told me it was probably a deer being attacked by a wild animal. I was so scared of it I barely walked into the woods at night the 3 years following, before moving into a city to go to university. Even this day I have never heard of an animal like that, and made me really doubt my mental health at the time. Because I had PTSD from a dog attack in middle school, and I sometimes had light hallucinations when I gamed for too long, like a black shadow that disappears immediately or things like that. There were barely any reports of wolves, coyotes or bears in my area, and believe me, I've made a lot of discoveries exploring the forest in this town. I grew up in the South. Tons and tons of beautiful places to see that haven't been taken over by concrete yet. It's nice, but along with that it's pretty boring. Being a teenager and wanting to go out and have fun led to mostly improvising with your buddies and hoping something good would come out of the night. There wasn't really a local spot to go hang out, like a club or a cool bar, and the places that were closest to this were boring, because you did them so many times. I'm sure if you've ever lived in a rural area, you can understand that feeling completely. Something that I found a ton of enjoyment in as a teenager was cruising around super late at night listening to music. I would fill my gas tank up, grab something to drink, a cigarrillo, and I would just take off driving around until the sun came up. It was a way for me to just clear my mind and relax. Those country back roads were always fun to drive down at 2 a.m. and was also just the right amount of spooky. Well, one night, I absolutely got more than what I bargained for. I can't remember which month it was in exactly, but I knew for a fact that it was in the summertime because I was out of school and also remember it being a comfortable, chill night. So, if I had to guess, it must have been around July. I was cruising around like I always did and was completely worry-free. I had music blaring and I was in my zone. I decided to head down to a park just out of boredom. This particular park is at the very end of a long stretch of desolate country road, but it was a really pretty drive because of that. When I say desolate country road, I don't mean that it's some dirt road that goes through the woods or anything crazy like that. It's a normal paved road, but there is really nothing on it after a certain point. The entire road takes about 20 minutes to drive down to get to the park, and after about 10 minutes into the drive, the houses start to get spread out further and further, to becoming no houses and just roads leading into the park. I think a lot of the reason I liked this drive at night, it's because of how creepy it was, and I looked at it as some sort of adventure or whatever. The park isn't open for camping or anything. It's mostly just a lot of land with walking trails and biking trails set up through miles of woods. So obviously at around 3 a.m. in the morning, it's pretty dead. I made it there and just did a slow and normal little loop around the park. The night before, it stormed very badly. So badly, in fact, I remember my parents and I had to take shelter because of the threat of a tornado touchdown. There ended up being no tornado, but the storms were pretty damn rough. Because of this, I came up on a fallen tree in the road that looped around to the exit of the park. That must have happened because of the storm. It wasn't some massive tree or something, but I knew for a fact that there was no way I could have gotten over it in my car, obviously. It was pitch black everywhere besides the front of my car because of my headlights, and just because of that, I immediately ruled out backing up the entire way. I just drove where I entered the park. I knew that was super dangerous, and there was no way. At this spot on the road, there was flat land on each side of me. I figured that would make most sense to just back up in the grass beside me, just a little, and then drive back the way I came. It was a long, one-way loop around the park, but I wasn't really worried about going out the wrong way since it was so late. So I started to back up off the road so that I could get my car turned around. All was good until I went to pull back up onto the road. I totally didn't take into account how wet the grass was and the amount of mud. My car went absolutely nowhere. My back tires were completely stuck and was spinning in place as I was trying to floor the gas pedal. I started to become pretty scared at this point. Not the most ideal situation to be in. I immediately take my cell phone out my pocket and saw that I had service, which was a huge relief. I called my parents and told them what happened and where I was. They were pretty pissed at me, but said that they will pay for a tow truck to come get me out. My parents both drove small 4-door sedans, and they would have been zero help in this situation. I was about 45 minutes away from my house and the rest of most human civilization. So I realized that I would be stuck out there for at least an hour before someone was able to come and get me. It was a freaky feeling, but I tried getting it out of my head and just continued to listen to music and be on my phone in the car while I waited. Not really much more I could do. After I kind of calmed down from the initial anger I had, I started to check out my surroundings. I didn't even notice at first because of everything going on. But in front of my car's placement was a field that was full of the most amount of deer I think I've ever seen at once. There legitimately must have been at least 40 just walking around and eating grass. The field wasn't directly in front of my car, but if I was to get out and throw a rock in that direction, it would have been easy for me to be able to hit one of them. So, I'd say around 30 yards away. This didn't really help with the creepy level going on. Looking out in the front of the car and seeing 80 eyes reflected staring back at you is a bit alarming, but I was relieved it was just a field of deer. I watched them for a little bit, but I was quickly over it and started to just browse through my social media apps while I waited. They seemed to have gotten over it quicker than I did, because they all went back to walking around and eating once they figured out I wasn't going to do anything to them. I browsed my phone for about 15 minutes, when I finally got a call from my parents letting me know that a tow truck guy is on his way and about an hour and a half from my location. Still to this day, I remember hearing that and having the thought, "You've got to be kidding me." I understood that me and only me was the reason I was in this situation. So I couldn't really be mad at anyone else, but that was very obviously not what I wanted to hear. I decided the smartest thing for me to do was to make sure all my doors were locked, lay back in my seat, and take a nap to pass the time quickly. So that's what I did. I wake up 45 minutes later to the feeling of being watched. I'm not sure if anyone has ever experienced that feeling before, because I don't know how common it is. But there was a sixth sense alarm going off in my head, telling me that I needed to wake up. Waking up to that feeling in the situation I was in, and the surrounding I was in, is probably worst case scenario. I sit up and immediately check my surroundings and see nothing. I looked through my car very quickly for any sort of weapon and found a pocket knife. I was very scared, even though I heard and saw absolutely nothing. That feeling is terrifying. I was shocked to see that the field of deer in front of me was still full of deer. I don't know anything about the animal, but I guess I always just assumed they didn't hang around in the same place for too long. I called my parents back to see if they had any kind of update from the tow truck. I decided to not mention the feeling I was having because I didn't want them to worry more. And I also knew that it was literally nothing more than a feeling I had, and had nothing to back up why I was feeling that way other than just being spooked out in general. No update from the tow truck guy, so we assumed everything was still fine on his end. The call lasted just a few minutes because I felt like such a dweeb. They both had to wake up for work in a few hours and now have to spend another random $100 on top of it all, and they were worried about me too. I could tell they were annoyed at the situation, but worried. I told them I'll make sure to tell them when the guy arrives and that I was sorry. We hung up, and I looked up from the phone and immediately went from 0 to 100 in panic mode. The deer in front of me were all completely perked and staring in the same direction, right of them. Let me remind you that there are around 40 deer in this field. Every single one of them was stopped dead in their tracks, standing completely still, looking at something. I put my high beams on and started waiting for absolutely anything to happen at all. Nothing. I tapped my horn real quick, and they didn't even budge or look my way. They were all still completely glued to what was by them. The way the tree line was, I couldn't see that far over into the field. I knew they were looking into the woods by them, but where I was only able to see them. I could hear my heartbeat. I grabbed that pocket knife and just waited for something to happen. I would say it was about a minute after I honked. Every single one of them in unison started to run in the opposite way. They were running at full speed, and within 20 seconds the field was devoid. I was petrified in fear. I knew that staying in my car is what would be the safest thing to do, but it's the worst feeling in the world when you feel like a sitting duck. My head was on a swivel. I was freaking out in every way possible, and I assumed that it was a bear or something, but it could have been absolutely anything. I was convinced at that point it was the devil himself. I don't know what to do. I knew that the tow truck was close by, but I had no idea where he was. I began to shake because of the nerves and just looked around to make sure nothing was with me, and focusing on the field in front of me. I did this for what felt like an eternity, sitting in complete silence and darkness in the middle of nowhere, waiting for something to jump out and attack you. 15 of the longest minutes of my life go by, and I start to see lights break through the tree line on the road. As it gets closer, I see it's the tow truck guy. The lights on his truck felt like it was Jesus coming from heaven to rescue me. He gets up to me, and I jump out my car and immediately ask him if he has a gun on him. I told him very quickly what just happened, and that something is definitely out here nearby. He let me know he had a shotgun in the truck, and assured me that it was most likely a bear or bobcat. He gave me the whole, "they're more scared of you than you are of them." The tree was small enough for him to sort of bulldoze it out the way, and then he attached my car to his and pulled me out of the spot. He was very nonchalant about what I had just experienced, but I was pretty badly shaken up from it. The whole time he was doing his thing, I had my eyes glued out in that field waiting for something. He was completely done in about 15 minutes and told me to follow his truck out of there onto the main road again. I got in my car and was ready, more than anything, to get the hell out of this park. We started to drive away from that spot, and I still had my head on a swivel, completely shaken. As we were driving away, I look in my rearview mirror. We were down the road, just a tiny bit, but I could still see the spot that I was stuck in. It was partially lit from the vehicle's lights and the moon. I watched in my rearview mirror as a man came out of the tree line behind where my car was and walked into the middle of the road and watched us drive away. My heart stopped beating. Legitimately, I lost my breath and my eyes started to get full of tears because of how absolutely scared I was in this moment. I couldn't see any sort of detail, like what he looked like or even necessarily what he was wearing. To be honest, I didn't really care. The feeling that I felt driving away from that spot, knowing he was right there the whole time, watching me, as I was freaking out and looking around, watching me as I was completely alone for the longest time, maybe even coming right up to my window and watching me as I slept. That's a feeling. That's something I can't necessarily put into words. All these years later, and it still messes with me quite a bit. The entire time we were driving off, as long as I could see him, he didn't move, just watched us in the road. A million things went through my mind. I was scared there may have been multiple people up the road waiting for us. I was trying to figure out if I could start beating on my horn like crazy to get the tow truck guy to stop or not. I decided that all I wanted to do was to get out of there more than anything. And the second that we finally got out of the park and were able to go onto a 2-lane road again, I flew past the tow truck driver and did nothing below 70 miles an hour the entire way home. I flew through the stop signs and absolutely did not care. The only thing on my mind was making it home. I got home, ran inside, very quickly acknowledged my parents and said sorry and thank you, and went to my room. I didn't get a single second of sleep for the rest of the night. I was searching for any sorts of records of things happening in that area, escaped convicts, similar stories, and I came to the conclusion that the man was some sort of squatter or homeless. I read many things online about how common it is for homeless in rural areas to build shelters in the woods, which does make sense. But obviously, the unknown is the scariest part of it all. What if he wasn't homeless? What if he was going to hurt me? What if? There are so many possibilities of what could have happened, but the outcome that did happen is what I am most grateful for. I never told my parents this story until many years after it happened, and I was already an adult and moved out. It freaked them the hell out too when I shared it. I never went back to that park, ever. Even though I no longer live by there, I still have no desire to go near there at all. I don't think I even could in broad daylight with a ton of people around. I also made the decision to stop doing these late night cruises. I did a few after that time with people, but even then I felt uncomfortable and on edge. So man in the woods, let's never meet again. A number of years ago, I was driving through the woods. It was dark, and I needed to get home. I was absolutely exhausted after another day doing the late shift. It must have been about 2 a.m. at this point. I'm driving through a fairly secluded patch of forest when I notice that my car starts acting funny. My headlights turn off, and I start playing with the buttons to try and make them turn on again, to no avail. I realize this is dangerous. I can no longer see where I'm going, and if someone, as unlikely as it is, starts coming down this road, I am in serious danger. So I pull over with the little moonlight visibility I have and park my car. There I try turning the engine off and on again, but once turned off, the car doesn't start. It just splutters and dies. This was in the era before cell phones, so I had two choices: walk in the dark until I found the nearest town to use a payphone, or wait it out till morning. I wasn't entirely sure which one I preferred, as it was dark and forested, and to be fair, I knew I had a very long way in either direction to get to the nearest town, so I chose to stay in the car. I reclined my seat and started getting myself comfortable. That's when I heard something in the distance, a sound like no other. A furious cry, mixed in with a growl. It sounded like the scream of a fox, and at least a handful of other creatures rolled into one. This horrific, primal screaming. I instantly jolted up from my reclined seat and looked out the window, scanning my surroundings. The lighting wasn't very good, and I could barely make anything out past the dark tree line. That's when I realized that if there was something out there, I was showing my face, so I instantly ducked and pretended I wasn't here. The sound happened a few minutes later, this time closer to my vehicle, and a few minutes after that, there was a definite scratching and a tapping on the back of my car. I dared not look up. If there was something there, it could obviously see me through the rear window. And I told myself I was being silly. I'm in a car, I'm protected. Nothing can hurt me. I slowly twist my head uncomfortably up, so that I'm still laying down but looking into the back window. And there's nothing there. With a pang of relief, I turn around to face the front window once more, which is where I see it. A creature the likes of which I have never seen. Tall, hairy, the mouth of a dog. It was horrific. Its long, bestial limbs outstretched, far taller than a human. I have no words for what this creature was. And in its own sickening way, it gave me a predatory grin, and I just about shat myself there and then. I fumbled to sit up, but was paralyzed with fear, and in a moment of bravery, as it started moving to the right of my car, as if it were going for the door, did I jolt up and spring into action. I plunged my keys into the car slot, twisted it, and by some kind of miracle the engine revved up. I put my foot on the accelerator and darted into the night. My headlights had started to work again, and I don't think I dropped below 90 the whole way home. When I reached my house at about 4 a.m., I couldn't sleep a wink. I wasn't sure what I saw, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. I know many of you are hearing this and thinking I sound absolutely insane, and trust me, if I hadn't experienced what I had, I'd be in the same boat as you. But I know what I saw, and there is something out there, and I have no intention of finding out what it is. Somewhere between June 27th, 1980 and April 23rd, 1981, I had a strange experience. This experience is the one that I have the most difficulty discussing with people. Part of the difficulty is that it was an experience that still frightens me when I think of it. The other part is the fear of people thinking I'm crazy. Of course, by sharing it with all of you, I am defeating that fear. We were living in Aberdeen, Maryland, on an army base. Not quite sure what a Marine was doing on an army base. We lived in military housing on the base. The house was a 2-story brick townhouse, and all of the houses on the base looked the same. I had a large bedroom and a king-size bed all to myself. On this night, I was sleeping. At the time, I slept with the light on, but dimmed because I was afraid of the dark. I woke up in the middle of the night and had an urge to play my kid-sized electric piano. I crawled out of bed and quietly walked to the piano across the room. I turned it on and sat back down on the bed while it warmed up. When I was certain that it was ready, I walked back to the piano and pushed the 2 lowest keys. I believe that Topher, my husband, told me a few weeks ago that these are usually A and B notes. The notes let out this low, depressive moan. I held the keys down for a while, not sure how long, and when I let go, I turned and looked at my closet. Standing there in my closet and reaching out for me were 4 beings. They had pale, slightish grey skin. They had large, black eyes. 2 slits made their nose, and non-existent ears and small mouths. They were all reaching out to me with their 4-digited hands. They wore black jumpsuits, and on the front of the jumpsuit was a metallic silver triangle logo, top pointed down, and emblazoned across the triangle was a blue metallic lightning bolt. They didn't move towards me. They just stood there at the door of the closet, reaching towards me. I ran towards the bed, hid my head under the covers and began to scream. Instantly, my mum and dad were there asking what was going on. I explained to them that the Coneheads were coming after me. I'm sure I had seen the Coneheads on Saturday Night Live at some point, and they were the only things that I remotely related to what I had seen, though they were nowhere close. I told them that I had played my piano, and then all of a sudden the Coneheads were reaching for me from my closet. Mum stayed in the bed to comfort me, while Dad walked over to the piano and pushed a key. Sure enough, the piano was on. As the key made the note, I told my dad to stop or they'd return. I don't know if I even went to sleep with my parents that night, or if I managed to fall back asleep after they spent some time with me, assuring me that there weren't Coneheads in the closet. The next morning, my dad took the piano outside and smashed it with a sledgehammer. In hindsight, I find that to be a rather odd reaction. It wasn't until years later, while I was in junior high, that I was watching Unsolved Mysteries, that I happened to see an illustration of what had appeared in my closet. These illustrations were from people who were abducted by aliens. My mum and sister were asleep when I was watching this show, and my dad was deployed in Kuwait for the Persian Gulf War. Upon seeing the images, I dropped to my knees and began shaking and crying. The images were exactly what I had seen, except most of the images of the Greys didn't have clothes on. Until finally there was one image, a drawing of a Grey wearing a black jumpsuit, and on the jumpsuit was the triangle insignia. No lightning bolt though. From time to time, I mentioned that night to my parents, and they have absolutely no recollection of me screaming my head off about the Coneheads. They do remember the destruction of my piano though. Was I abducted? I don't know. Why did they come to me? Did pushing the lowest note on my piano call them, or was it just a coincidence? Will they come back? Originally, I would tell you that I hope the hell not, but maybe if they did, maybe I could get the answers that I have been looking for. Back in September, I was taking hunter education classes with my dad. Basically, you learn parts of a gun, how to handle a gun safely. Since it was in person and not the online classes, the instructors had stories to tell. These were about people not handling theirs correctly, drunk shooting, and the like. And as you can imagine, most of them didn't end well. We were going shooting a lot these 2 weeks to prepare for the test at the end. One time we went to an abandoned town that a lot of people shot at. It had been shut down due to high lead levels. I had butterflies, and the whole ride I brushed it off as nerves. That evening, we were the only ones there. We thought it would be pretty nice since there'd be more spots open. We settled on a spot behind a hill and shot another hill nearby. My dad was sighting the .22 gun we had brought, and I was sitting behind him. My earplugs were in, so it was hard to hear things, especially far away, when all of a sudden, there was a very loud shot. It had to have been my dad since it was so close to him and loud. I was initially scared, as the previously mentioned stories we were told of shots being accidentally fired never ended well. In a concerned voice, I asked if it was my dad. When he said no, my fear became much greater. Another shot was fired, and our only thought was to become seen. We quickly unloaded the gun so it was safe and ran up the hill. My mum was wearing yellow, and we were all jumping up and down waving our arms. There was no way we couldn't have been seen. After 2 or 3 more shots, we ran to the edge. It was like a valley or dried out lake. The edges were very high, and we were at the bottom with the shooter at the top. The next part confirmed our belief that they had seen us, and still continued anyway. My dad called the police to report what was happening. He walked further out to see details like the color of the truck and how many people, and was in the view of the shooter. Just a bit after my dad got on the phone, the guy left, probably assuming the cops and other authorities were called. We wished we had brought the gun, because we were convinced he was shooting at us. We stayed where we were for a long time waiting for the police, when a group of maybe 4 high schoolers came. My dad went and warned them about the previous events, and we decided after 15 minutes of waiting and no police arriving, and we just wanted to get out of there. We went avid, gathered our stuff, and I looked at where the shots had went with some goggles and something that told distance. The shots were no more than 25 meters away. If he had bumped the gun just a bit, we would have been dead or in the hospital. Driving away, the police finally came. They asked us some questions, and we were finally able to get the hell out of there. He was unfortunately never caught, and we never went back there. We don't know if he was trying to mess with us, trying to shoot us, or just drink. But we were terrified for our lives. When I was younger, around 7 or 8 years old, I used to sleep with my parents in their bed. Their bedroom had a computer room with a window looking out to the driveway and up the cul-de-sac. One night, it was just me and my dad sleeping in the bed. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked out the window and saw a car with its high beam lights on, pulling all the way into our driveway. I awoke my dad and told him someone was in the driveway. He went to check, as well as I, and there were no cars anywhere. He said I just dreamt it. I know I didn't, but I didn't bother making a fuss. We went back to sleep. The same night, I woke up and saw a car out on the street with its lights on, illuminating the street in front of it. I got up and looked out the window, and someone was standing there. A very tall man was standing in front of the car, motionless in front of the headlights. I was so confused. I looked out the window for a few minutes before getting back into bed. I had no idea why the man was standing out there, and I had no idea why the car's headlights were facing him. Now this is where it gets weird. I sometimes sleep alone, admittedly scared because my parents weren't there. For some reason I was able to sleep in that eerie room sometimes, but it always made me uncomfortable. One night, I had my first and only experience with sleep paralysis. Funnily enough, I woke up, noticed I couldn't move, and went back to sleep. There were no demons on top of me or anything I could see in the room, and when I fell back asleep I had a dream of a tall, thin, purple figure standing over me. It had very large human-like eyes that were staring at me. I knew it wasn't human. It stood there for a while, and I was confused and curious. The figure then leaned over my bed and dissipated into the bed at the end of my feet. To this day, I think it was a form of an extraterrestrial being. It had to have been correlated to the first previous event, the car pulling into the driveway, the strange man standing out on the street. As I'm writing this, I'm not entirely sure if it was a car illuminating the tall man, or if that car was actually a UFO pulling into the driveway, which beamed lights towards our house. What I do know is that I think a lot about it. Now, this story takes a turn. I'm diagnosed with bipolar 1 disorder, which can switch over into psychosis if I become too manic. I've suffered from a psychotic break 3.5 years ago and lost my mind, during which I thought I could speak to aliens, and I couldn't stop reading religious texts. One day I was in my basement, going through the psychosis, and could see pink, blue and yellow lights shining through my basement window. Now you might be thinking it was the sun reflecting through the window. It was a windy, cloudy day, and the sun kept peeking through the clouds, causing the visual perception of lights to flicker in the window. Right? Well, why were there colourful lights moving in swirls and showing geometric patterns? There was a thin piece of white cardboard covering the window, so I could see exactly where the lights were hitting. The cardboard was translucent enough to see these strange shapes shifting. I went to the window, took off the cardboard, and there was nothing. The lights had vanished, and all I could see were the clouds moving quickly due to how windy it was, and the sun peeking through repeatedly, causing a flickering effect. I'm well aware that I could have been hallucinating, but there is another part of the story that makes it even more interesting. For some strange reason, I was making videos of myself joking around and being somewhat childish. But it was disturbing because I was 18 at the time, and I rewatched one of the videos and heard a disoriented moan. I did not make that sound. It came as if someone had made a moan through the microphone. It sounded like it came from an electronic device. I later deleted the video after I came back to reality. The videos were so unimaginably cringy that I deleted the lot of them. Before the psychosis had begun, I went on a nighttime walk with my mother. As we turned a corner for about a second, I saw blue glowing light in the sky. It looked as big as the size of a dinner plate, that's how close it was. As I began to point to it, I turned to my mother asking her if she sees it. As my mother turned towards me and asked me what I was talking about, the UFO retreated into the night sky, like it only wanted me to see it. I told my mother what I saw, and she gave me a concerned look. I laughed at excitement, because my dad had recently told me about a UFO he saw when he was younger. After that experience, I went psychotic. These events I experienced as a child, and the UFO encounters I had are 100% real to me. I believe in aliens, and I believe I was contacted. I'm 21 now and haven't seen anything since. I'm properly medicated and attend therapy now. I'm more stable than I've ever been. if any aliens are hearing this, I hope you guys weren't the ones that gave me this mental illness. I used to ride a motorcycle as the sole method of transportation when I was studying, and I used to work on hotel cocktail bars during the summer holidays. 6 years ago, I was working at a historic, stereotypical grand hotel in a very rural area of the UK. I worked a long afternoon and evening into the night, finished cleaning up the bar around 2 a.m, and walked through the underbelly of the hotel to retrieve my motorcycle and make the journey home. I can still clearly remember the feeling of the crisp night air and the absolute pitch black silence of the countryside after the hot and seemingly never-ending nights of serving drinks to dinner-goers and party-goers. It was always sort of intensely relaxing. Now that being an adult meant not being scared of the dark, or being outside on a motorcycle in the middle of nearly nowhere at 2 a.m. Riding through the local towns took me a few minutes before I left to follow a dark country road home. At this point I rode a Honda 125cc, around 11 horsepower. Basic and old, but clean. It did the job, regardless of its quirks, such as the dim headlights, which would dim and flicker, even more when coming to a stop. I was riding along these pitch-black roads with fields and woods surrounding me, very much alone for 20 minutes. Then I saw a brief blast of blue light headlights in my mirrors coming from behind. Moments later, dazzling headlights arrived behind me in seconds. Almost immediately, a large Range Rover pulls out to overtake me, blasting past barely inches away from me, and I respond with a long blast on my horn. The Range Rover pulls in front of me and slams on the anchor, in what seems like an attempt to have me lose control under my sudden braking or rear-end the range. Bikes can, even when they're old and rely on dumb brakes, stop pretty quickly. So I didn't rear-end the maniac in front. I came to a controlled stop. I see the door of the Range crack open, and a figure began to step out. I went for it, using all 11 horsepower of the little Honda's power, pulling an overtake. However, in those moments, this anger-crazed maniac had shut his door and stepped on the accelerator, causing us to be level and accelerating together when I reached his car. He then started to run me off the road, pulling to the right, wedging me further over towards the ditch at the side of the road. And this is where I ended up struggling to control the bike on the wet, dew-heavy grass around the side of the road, trying to stop the 140-kilogram motorcycle dropping into the ditch. I struggled to regain balance, but managed to pull the bike back onto the road. At this point, I noticed the guy had gotten back out of the Range Rover and walked around the back, opened it, and was reaching inside. I had turned the bike to face the other side of the road, ready to turn either way and make an escape from the escalating situation. Just as I looked to turn, I took one more look over at him and see him pulling a large object out of the back of the Range. I just went for it, taking another glance over my shoulder around 200 meters to see he continued driving up the road away from where I'd ran off the road. I slowed down to see what he'd do next. After driving away from me, he reached the top of the road and pulled over to the left, waiting for me, the light reflecting on the road. It was eerie. My heart was beating so fast, yet it felt like time had stopped. I just carried on in the opposite direction to find an alternate home route in the pitch black. Just before doing this, I checked my phone for signal to see that I had no mobile coverage at all. Fantastic. To this day, I keep wondering what happened to come across my sister. It was wintertime here in the suburbs of North Virginia. I live with my family in a neighborhood not too far from Washington, D.C., so that's not to say we're in the middle of nowhere. Although our home is very close to a few decently large wooded parks. One night, I was at my then girlfriend's place up near the city. I got a phone call from my sister around 7, which in winter makes it pretty much nighttime here. I didn't think anything of it. Usually she calls me for random things she needs my insight on. I bet I'm up my sister. Ever since she was little, she loved horror movies. Growing up with her, I can tell you firsthand that she isn't easily scared and loves the paranormal. Alright, back to the call. I picked up the phone and first thing I realized was her voice was breaking up. She was sobbing and could barely talk clearly. Instantly, my mind started rushing with horrible thoughts about what could have happened. She kept trying to tell me to come home as soon as possible. I asked her why and if everything's okay, and she wouldn't say. She just kept asking me to come home. Obviously, I got in my car and rushed home. The neighborhood is very dim. There aren't many lights on, only the few solar panel garden lamps from surrounding homes. And as soon as I got home, I ran inside and asked her again what happened. And she finally began explaining. About half an hour before she called me, she went outside to grab a few things from her car again. It was dark out, but when the car is unlocked, the headlights turn on. When she opened the door to the car, the light was shining from the driveway onto the roof of the garage, and she noticed it from the inside of the car. A short, bipedal human-looking thing standing on two jet-black muscular legs. At first, she thought it was a raccoon, but this would have been obvious to her. But this thing, it scared her to the point of crying. While she was in the car, her view was obstructed from the rest of the creature, which was crouching, and from what she described, was scratching at something on the roof, trying to get in. Maybe. But she wasn't going to just stick around to find out. She got out of the car, pretending to not have spotted it. This thing, it acted in a seemingly intelligent way. She thought maybe if I act like I didn't see it, it would just stay up there and not try to attack me or anything. But as she walked behind the car, she heard it stand upright. Startled, she looked directly up at it. She gave me the following description. It was jet black, smooth, dolphin-like skin, with arms and legs, 5-digit hands and no claws, dead-looking, very dirty, and hair covering its head and body. The face is what was disturbing. The face had 2 shining yellow eyes that glowed from the car's headlights, no nose, just 2 slits, and a very wide mouth with no lips. She took off when she made eye contact, and as soon as she was indoors, she called 911, and an officer was dispatched to our house. He looked around back to try and see if there was any damage or any sign of someone climbing on the roof, but there were no footprints nor damage. It was all in place. The officer just told us to lock the doors and windows and left. It's not like my sister to be terrified to the point of calling the police. Whatever this thing was, though, I can only imagine what it was actually like to witness something like this in real life. To this day, both me and her get extremely uneasy, arriving home after dark, thinking that something might be waiting there for us. My family has lived in northern Maine for about 4 generations. I was born and raised here, as was my father, both his parents, my great-grandfather, and my great-great-grandmother. My parents and grandparents all had lives in which they would leave Maine and see the bigger world. They would live in New York, Los Angeles, and on a farm in Iowa. At some point, however, they would all return to the little middle-of-the-woods town in northern Maine that I have lived in all my life. 5 years ago from today, my grandfather, Bruce Gray, died. He was the second oldest of 5 boys, but he is the only one I ever got a chance to meet. His older brothers, Robert and his 3 younger ones, Oliver, Joe, and James, were all killed when Bryce was a boy in 1962. Our town is surrounded by dense woods, and very few people live here. That isolation and the size of our little home meant that everyone pretty much knows everyone, and more or less everything that goes on, the folks that live here know about. Neither my parents or my older sister Eva would tell me what happened to my great uncles, and even though everyone seemed to know everything, no one in the town seemed to be able to speak about the killing of 4 young boys 57 years ago. 57 years is a long time, but not so long that these deaths should be forgotten. 2 weeks before my grandpa died, he finally opened up about what happened to his brothers. He came into my room and sat on my bed saying, "Your father and mother do not wish me to tell you this, but you aren't much older than I was when my brothers died." I stopped the paper I was writing and turned to look at my grandfather. I was stunned. He never spoke of them, and I was always yelled at when I asked questions regarding my great uncles, even if it wasn't related to their deaths. My grandfather continued, "My son doesn't believe what happened, not since he met your mother, and became convinced that the things like my brother's deaths are impossible. He was furious when I told Eva on her 17th birthday, and I'm sure he will be even more furious when he learns that I told you." He stopped talking and motioned for me to come over to the bed with him. I moved to sit next to him, but before I sat down he asked, "I'm gonna tell you because I want you to be safe, to use what I know to protect yourself. You need to know what happened, because I am sure the same thing that murdered my brothers is still out there, feeding, living in the woods." I sat down. "I want to know what happened, the truth, why no one will tell me, and why even the mention of your brothers angers people." "Good, because this is not something I would let you hear. You're 16, 2 years older than I was, and 2 years younger than Robert. Oliver was 13, and the twins, Joe and James, were 10. We practically lived in the forest around town, exploring trails, climbing trees, chasing rabbits and other animals. We always stuck together, and in all seasons we were out there doing something." My grandfather wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at my bookcase, full of not books, but wooden animals that I have carved and placed on those shelves since I was 10, and learnt to carve from my father. He wasn't really looking at my animals, but more at the open air between them, remembering the years he spent in the forest with his brothers. It was almost July, and Robert was to go away for the summer before coming back to help our father with the store. Our father had always told us not to go more than a few miles into the forest alone. This was a rule that we always followed, until the week before Robert was meant to leave. We decided that while Robert was still here, all 5 of us would go out into the woods and spend a night or 2 further than any of us had ever been. We all knew how to hunt, read maps, and basic survivals from our father, and saw no reason that we couldn't. Besides, Robert was an adult now. He said the last part, dripping with sarcasm, and a sour look spread across his face before continuing with his story. We all packed bags that we used when going out with our father. We packed everything we needed, from food to flint for a fire. We all were armed with the silver knives our grandfather had given us when we turned 10. He said that they were made by the settlers of this town, and that they would never rust or dull and would protect us. They didn't. We left a note for our parents and left. Robert led us. He was the oldest and holding the map. The map didn't have any specific pathway, and after about 10 or so miles, it was just a dark green blob of the forest. In the center of that blob, some 30 or so miles off the map, is where he wanted to go. When we got to the section of the forest that the map did not show, we started cutting arrows into trees, pointing back home. We left early in the morning, and it was late in the day, I'd say 5ish, when Robert was happy with a clearing and we made camp. The clearing we chose was small, surrounded by impossibly dense forest to every side. It was a few yards away from a stream, and the woods around us were plentiful with life. After we pitched an old tent, we set out to explore the woods near our new clearing. There was nothing remarkable, just trees and life. The sound of birds and other animals moving about it was a peaceful and beautiful thing. As he described their trek through into the unknown wilderness, the sour expression left his face and was replaced by a mixture of happiness and regret. It was long and tiring to get there, but the clearing made it worth the trip. We all seemed to regain our energy and chased each other around like half of us weren't coming up on adulthood. We had built a fire to cook a squirrel or rabbit that Robert caught for us. Robert was putting the poor animal over the fire when I first found a sign that something wasn't right in our clearing. His hands turned to fists, and the slightly happy, reminiscent tone that was in his voice vanished. I was walking around the clearing when I saw something sticking out of the ground. I pulled it up. Out the ground, thinking it was odd. It was a whitish rock. I immediately dropped it. It was a jawbone. At the time I couldn't tell what animal it was from. I'd never seen a human jawbone before, but I am now sure that it was indeed from a human. The jawbone still had a few scraps of greying meat or tissue still attached to it. I told Robert, but he brushed it off, telling me that it had been there a long time, and it was just some other animal's kill, like the one we were about to eat. We ate our kill and went to bed. The jawbone sat in the back of my mind. It worried me, you see, because I cannot say what kind of animal it came from. It never occurred to me. It could be human. I do not know when it was, but I woke up in complete darkness, and it was apparent that something was immediately wrong. The forest around our clearing was completely silent. No nocturnal animals moving through the brush, no insects humming in the trees, no wind rustling in the leaves. It was the end of June, and the forest was completely silent. Or so I thought, until I heard the only noise there was to hear. A cracked, scared voice of a woman calling for help. The voice was wrong. The words were right, and logic said that there was a woman out there in need of aid. But it was wrong, like the words were coming out of a throat that was not made to speak human languages. We were all sleeping in the old tents, and as I started to get up, Robert motioned for me to sit back down. I did so, and Robert himself left the tent. He called out to the woman and was greeted by another cry. The fire was still smouldering, and I could see the wood catch as he fed more to the fire. As Robert moved around the clearing calling for the woman to follow his voice to our fire, the others began to wake. Oliver asked me what the hell was going on. At the same instant, James asked what smelt like rotten eggs. I had no idea what he was talking about, and instead told Oliver and the others about the woman in the woods. Oliver was watching the shadowy image of Robert moving around the tent, and Joe was pulling on his hair, a habit that both the twins had when they were younger and scared. James finally spoke. But his voice was wrong, not his normal excited squeak, and not even nervous stutters. It was a cold, dead-sounding noise that made me think that James knew everything that was going to happen. The sound of that voice, coming from my little 10-year-old brother, was a terrible thing. "That's not a woman. It's a man with horns." Those are the words he spoke. The words that caused my blood to run cold. The words that caused me to leave the tent and join Robert in our clearing. The woman's voice was getting closer, coming from just beyond the north side of our clearing. As she got closer, I realized that the voice was on a loop. The exact same tone, the exact little hiccup after help, and the same sob after me. I think Robert saw it too, because he stiffened in front of me and told me to stay behind him. The others had all exited the tent, and Oliver handed me my knife. Neither me nor Robert thought to get them, but Oliver had, and at that moment I was more happy to have my knife than I was to have anything else. The voice was now just beyond the light of the fire. It turned less and less human as it drew closer, and in the middle of the last cry for help, the words turned into a predatory growl. The shadow that was barely visible in the dark tree line past the fire was that of a hulking and distorted human being. It started to step into our clearing. My grandfather started to shake. His eyes widened and he went as pale as ice. His voice started to fill with fear. It was like he was back in that clearing, watching this monster approach them. "Grandpa?" I tried to pull his attention back to me and away from the horrors of his past. He just kept talking, not even realizing I said anything. The beast stood there, on the other side of the fire. It seemed to be letting us take its appearance in. It was taller than I imagined it could be. Hunched over, as it was, I swear that it was at least 8 feet tall. It was standing on 2 impossibly long back legs, ending in long, narrow feet that seemed to only have one toe tipped with a terrible dagger-like talon. Its arms staring high up on its shoulders, or at its sides. The long fingers at the end of its arms all ended in similar black talons that seemed to absorb the light from the fire. Its claws must have been a foot long. They seemed to be brushing the dirt at its side while it breathed. It was impossibly thin, and its clay-colored skin fit its body so poorly that I could see every bone outline across the entirety of it. It had no hair, and I could see where its genitals should have been. The skin was flat and seamless. I brought my gaze up away from its monstrous body and to its deformed face. The skin was pulled just as tightly around its skull as it was around the rest of its body. Its faces resembled humans, while at the same time being completely wrong. It had no lips, just deep grooves where they should have been. This absence revealed a mouth full of crooked needle-like teeth and a long, dark blue tongue hanging out one side of its mouth. Black saliva rolling down it like a sap from a tree. Its eyes were the worst part, like an owl's but sunken deep into its skull. They were bright yellow. It seemed to me that the firelight caused them to glow, giving off a minuscule amount of light of their own. The smell of death quickly filled and cleared, steaming from the thing that had entered. For what seemed like an endless amount of time we stood there, me and my brother on one side of the fire, and this monster on another. We studied it while it studied us, no one moving. I tightened my grip on my knife. I wanted some kind of magic protection between me and this thing. Then the spell was broken. Robert stepped backwards and his foot landed right on a stick. and the monster let out a blood-curdling yell. Oliver dropped the rest of the knives, never having the chance to give them to the others. Joe screamed and started to turn away from the beast. Robert swore and started backing up faster. James stood watching the monster as it screamed into the air and jolted forward. It moved fast, impossibly fast, faster than anything I had ever seen. As it came for us, it brought one taloned hand up, and the next thing I knew was that the arm Robert had started raising to protect his face was missing half a foot of itself. Joe was running with Oliver not far behind. James was still standing, staring at the beast as its mouth full of crooked needles closed around Robert's throat. I grabbed James by the arm and started to drag him with me. I did not need to drag him far, as he started running as fast as he could on his own. I kept hearing ripping noises from behind me, but I kept running behind the others, trying to keep them all in sight. The tearing noises stopped, and around me the wind picked up out of nowhere. The wind was blowing from behind us, from the clearing. It was pushing us along, blowing leaves to chase us, bending trees to look down at us, severing branches from trunks to attack us. Though the wind roared in my ears, I could hear the crack of the branch and thought of the cloud of dirt and leaves blocking my vision. I could hear the branch strike Joe ahead of me. He had started crying when he described how the monster lunged at Robert. He continued crying and told me Oliver and James had ran ahead. I had to shove James forward to keep him from stopping for Joe. I stopped for him, threw the branch off him and stopped. He was breathing still, short and uneven breaths, but still breathing. The branch hadn't killed him, but it had broken his skull. I did not know what I should do, but neither did I have any time to think about it. The wind had passed me, and even though I could still see its ripping branches of trees in the pursuit of my brothers, the smell of death was suddenly in my nose again, all around me, never ending. A growl filled my ears and an impossibly solid, impossibly skinny, impossibly strong stick hit me in the back and sent me flying. To this day, I do not know why I did not die after it threw me across the forest floor. Somehow, I did not splatter against a tree or fall onto rocks. The blow did not break my back, though it should have, as its talons did not slash me in half like I was made of paper. Somehow, I fell 10 or 15 feet away from the monster that had pulled about Joe's head and started devouring its contents completely unharmed. I wish I had yelled, tried to do anything to save Joe, to save Robert, but I did nothing. I turned away from the monster and its feast, and I ran. I ran in the direction I thought James and Oliver went, and in a matter of moments I saw them, ahead, and to the right of me, running faster than I thought anyone as small as them could possibly go. I caught up to them, and we ran until we reached a wide open, moving river that we could not possibly cross. The wind had died down. It was no longer a powerful gale, but a light breeze carrying a haunting siren that seemed to emanate from the deepest part of the forest. The siren got louder, more consistent, and the wind picked up, freezing cold despite the fact that it was the end of June. It was there, seemingly appearing with the wind, not a foot behind Oliver, before I fully comprehended the figure behind Oliver. It grabbed him, one arm wrapped around his middle, the other his arm, cutting into his arms. In one moment, Oliver's arms were ripped from his body, and the monstrous claw disabled him. Oliver fell into the river, with his organs sliding into the ground. James and I looking on in horror as the beast. He stopped talking, no longer able to continue through his emotions. I had tried to comfort him, but he never even noticed that I was still there with him. A few moments after he continued, I ran at that bastard with my knife in my hand, yelling. I wasn't thinking. I just knew I needed to kill it. It swatted me like a bug. I flew into the base of a tree, but somehow I was still unhurt. I sat against the trunk of the tree, looking at the knife in my hands, dazed before something thick and warm dripped onto the back of my neck. I looked up into the distorted evil face inches from my own. Its eyes were a bright fluorescent yellow, and they really did give off their own light. They were sitting in what looked like a congealed blood, never blinking, and its pupils were like pinpoints. Blood covered its needle-filled mouth and dripped down its dark tongue, mixing with its black saliva. It started reaching for me, and without thinking, I brought my knife up, slashing its face and cutting through one glowing yellow eye. The beast screamed in pain before rushing backwards. Its face was smoking where I parted its skin. I took the opportunity to run, passing Oliver's corpse and grabbing James's arm one last time to pull him with me. Unlike earlier, James was frozen. He allowed himself to be dragged, but would not run on his own. I dragged him through the woods, all the while pained howls possessed the air around us. It took us hours, but I had thought that we had gotten away. It was still too early in the morning to see much, and I sat James under a tree so we could rest a short while. James told me he had seen the monster in his dreams before. He said 3 days before we left, he dreamt that Robert, Oliver, and Joe would be cut to ribbons, and that he, James, would be left running through the woods screaming how his feet were going to burn him up. He had trouble telling me this, because he was weeping almost uncontrollably, but somehow he got to sleep, still weeping. The last thing he asked me was, "Why do I still smell rotting meat?" He never gave me time to answer. James was plagued with terrible night terrors that caused him to scream out and talk incomprehensibly in his sleep. Nothing I did could wake him or calm him down, and eventually I must have started to doze. The next thing that I knew, my ears are full of screaming, louder and further away all at once than they were a moment ago. It was James screaming, and I quickly saw that his clothing, which were illuminated by the first light of the morning, was strewn across the ground in a small path leading away from where I had been sleeping. I started following the clothing and saw James, yards away, running faster than he had at any other point that night, screaming at the top of his lungs. I ran after him, and for a time I was gaining. As I got close, I could hear him saying, "It's so hot, it's burning me up." I was almost on him. I was going to grab him, but he jumped over a pit, and I didn't quite see it until my foot got caught in it. I fell, twisted my ankle, and hit my head on a log. James screamed about the thing burning him up, and it was the last thing I heard before I fell unconscious. He stopped speaking, and I waited a few moments for him to continue, but he didn't. "What happened?" I finally asked. He started, seemingly forgetting that he was telling me this story. He stood up and told me to follow him. We left my room, descended the stairs, crossed through the living room, and entered my grandfather's room. The walls were covered in paintings of dark woods that my grandfather had illustrated. The painting that I never really thought about before looked strangely ominous. He had been deathly quiet all the while we were walking to his room, but as he opened up his closet and started rummaging through it, he spoke again. After going back to where we had slept, I collected James' clothing and the knife that I had left behind when chasing after him. The sun was almost directly overhead when I finally limped back into the trees we had carved arrows into. It was starting to get dark again when I made it back to the house. We never found James, or any remains of the others. and within a year, I left this terrible town we live in. I left to study the occult, to study the monster that attacked us. When I discovered its name, what it could do, everything from that night made sense. It was a Wendigo, a deformed, cannibalistic human spirit made into a monster. It consumes human flesh, it can mimic human voice and control the weather. It's a monster of unimaginable strength and speed. It tears people apart and can make them go mad with fever. I think that's what happened to James. After years, I came back here hoping to find it, to kill it. How did you know it wasn't already dead? I knew it was still alive, you see, because they can live for hundreds of years before the spirit moves on and possesses a new host, corrupting them and either merging with the new soul or destroying it. He had uncovered an old wooden trunk that was covered by years of junk piling up in the back of the closet. He was having trouble pulling the trunk out of the closet, so I got up and helped. As we worked, he spoke. I spent years looking for this monster, going into the woods, searching for the Wendigo, but I never found him. Sometime in my 20s, I found the silver knives that we had left behind in the clearing. I found other things too, body parts and trees, a cave where I think it once lived, cuts in trees and rocks left by its talons, but never the beast. We got the trunk out and used an old key on a string from around his neck to open it. Inside was an old revolver, a sheathed knife, and 3 leather-bound journals and countless pencil drawings. My grandfather motioned for me to look through the trunk contents. I had an old acquaintance of mine melt down my brother's knives and turned the melted silver into bullets. I wanted to use those bullets to kill it. I put the gun down carefully on the bed and picked up the knife. The sheath was well made, leather dyed a dark blue, with golden symbols sewn into it. The sheath was obviously newer than the knife, whose leather hilt was old and worn by use and age. I unsheathed it, revealing a silver blade as sharp and embellished as the day it was made. My grandfather was right. The knife never rusted or lost its edge, and I carried it with me every day for over 20 years. Resheathing the knife and placing it next to the revolver, I took out the 3 journals. In those, I wrote down everything I learned about the mysteries of the world. They contain information on many mythical items and people that I encountered. I always wanted to give them to your dad, but he never accepted the truth of our world. It broke my heart when he refused them. Unopened, I set the journals down in a stack next to me. Taking one of the many stacks of drawings and shifting slowly through them, one of the drawings showed a creature like the one my grandfather had described, the Wendigo. But others showed images of people with fangs, living trees, creatures with the faces of different animals, spirits and ghouls. A few showed not monsters but men, women and children, all massacred in various ways. About halfway through the stack, I put it down and looked up at my grandfather. He was watching me, studying my reaction, trying to see if I believed what my father refused to. "Are all of these real?" I asked quietly. "All of those are not only real, but things I fought. There are more than just Wendigos out in the world. Countless evils share this plane of existence with us, and I've come across many here in my time. After each battle, I would draw the monster that was my opponent. It helped me cope with what had happened and what I need to do. When I did not save a victim, I drew them as I found them, as a way to remember them, and to strengthen my resolve to save the victims of the next monster." I started to put all of the items back into the trunk, before pushing it back into the depths of the closet again. I did not tell you all this so you could rush out and try and find that Wendigo, those woods, and the beast that stole my brother's lives and destroyed mine. I do not want that for you. I told you, so you know what's out there. The thing that preys on humanity, even though it's not my purpose. If you ever decide you need to know more about the things out there, then go through my journals. Call my old contacts. They already know you might reach out. Before anything else was said, my father entered the room. Furious, he sent me out. Before I had even closed the door, he was yelling at my grandfather for poisoning me with those ludicrous monsters of his. I did not ever speak about the Wendigo or any other monster to my grandfather again. I did not know what I wanted to do. I couldn't go back to the innocent childhood that I had been enjoying before our talk. I couldn't just march off to kill monsters either. I didn't want to die like my great-uncles, and I had not developed my need to save others. 2 or so weeks after I learnt about the Wendigo, my grandfather walked into the woods and never returned. When I realized where he had gone, and that he would not be returning, I rushed into his room. I once again pulled out the trunk, meaning to break open the lock if I had to, but there was no need. Resting on top of the trunk were 2 items, the key and a note. I read the note first. To my only grandson, I have decided to find the Wendigo that murdered my family. I do not plan to kill it. I do not think I'm able to. Instead, I plan to let it kill me, so that when I see my brothers again, we will be on equal footing. We will have known the same hardship and the same death. I feel the need to see that monster one more time, and this is the only time left. I'm leaving you everything in this trunk. Do with it what you will. Do not be controlled by revenge like I was. If you try to hunt down the monster, do it for the living and not for the dead. I know that you are a better man at 16 than I ever was, and I love you for it. Goodbye, my grandson. Love, Grandpa. I read his note 3 times before carefully folding it up and putting it in my pocket. I unlocked the trunk and opened it. Everything was exactly where I had put it weeks before. The revolver and the knife were still untouched. My grandfather brought no form of protection with him to face the Wendigo. I reached for the gun, intending to run after him and fight the Wendigo to save him. But I didn't. Instead, I picked up his first journal and thumbled through it until I came across a list of names. Each name was accompanied by a phone number, and I realized that these were my grandfather's contacts. In the 24 hours that followed, I called every number in that list and started forming my own journey to leave my little hometown and learn the truth of this world. 5 years have passed since I left home, and I've only been back for a week. In that week, my room has changed a lot. The comic books are gone. So are the fantasy novels, the piles of homework, the toys I used to play with. Even the animals I used to carve are missing from my shelves. In their place, 3 newer wood carvings sit. A horned snake with 2 tails, a man with tattered wings and the leg of a goat, and a dog with 3 heads. These 3 carvings are all the images of the 3 monsters I have killed since leaving here. At the foot of my bed, there's a trunk containing 3 old journals, a revolver, a silver knife with a new leather grip to match its sheath, as well as old books, one of which is specifically about the legend of the Wendigo, and 2 new knives, one of silver and one of iron. In front of me is my very own journal. Inside is the note that my grandfather wrote for me, the details of all 3 of my other hunts, and this entry. I am writing this in here because I'm going to enter the forest tonight and kill the Wendigo. I plan to leave this here in case I do not return, so that my family will know what happened to me. Whether I live or die, I want you to know that I have a life I'm proud of. I've saved lives and have made this world a little safer and filled with fewer monsters than when I found it. I do not plan for this hunt to be my last, and will do my damnedest to come back for this journal, but I know it doesn't mean I will. I love you all. Dean Gray. I had been at my cousin's wedding, which was across the country. We had to stay at a hotel at the time. We'd been up since 8 a.m. and spent the whole day celebrating, so everyone was tired. My dad had been drinking and wasn't able to drive us back to the hotel, so my mum, my sister and I made plans to get a lift from my auntie and uncle. My dad and my brother went with my other auntie and uncle. So anyway, we had left the venue and had been driving for about 10 minutes down a dark, deserted one-way road. Everything was fine. I was sitting in the back seat with my mum and sister, and we were all just chatting, although I was half asleep. That was until my uncle cursed under his breath and the car slowed down. This woke me up fully, because I knew that the road was very long, and there were only trees on the sides of it. Also, I was young, and I believed that cursing was a terrible sin. When the car stopped completely, I sat up a bit, trying to see what was going on. Then I saw a man walking towards the car. This couldn't have been as scary as it was if it wasn't pitch black in the middle of nowhere, and if the man didn't have a load of glass shards in his face. It was a horrifying sight. There were pieces of glass in his skin. It was so bloody. There was even a big shard sticking out of his cheek. He knocked on the window and motioned for my auntie to roll down hers. She rolled it down a little bit. "What do you want?" my uncle asked. "Could you give me and my friend a ride to the hospital?" the man with the glass in his face asked. "Friend?" I thought to myself. I couldn't see another man, and that's when a second man walked out from the bushes. He also had glass in his face. It was so bloody. The second man walked over to the driver's side of the car where my uncle was, and he asked my uncle to roll down his window as well. My uncle complied, but like my auntie, only rolled it down a little bit. "Can you please give us a ride?" "I'm sorry, but there isn't any room," my auntie said. The first man looked to the back seat, as if he didn't believe my auntie, and we made eye contact. It was probably the scariest 5 seconds I've ever experienced. Just then he pulled on the handle of the car door and it opened. This is when I started to panic, and I could feel my mum tense up. My auntie struggled with the man to try and close the door. Luckily enough, the man seemed like he had been drinking, so he wasn't as strong as he would have been if he was sober. The second man didn't seem to be doing much. He just seemed to be watching the whole thing play out. Finally, my aunt was able to close the door and lock it. "Just take this, I'm sorry." My auntie scrambled for her purse and pulled out a €20 note. I can't remember if the man took it or not. The last thing I do remember about the night was my uncle driving away as fast as he could. I just spoke to my sister, who was 16 at the time. Apparently her and my mum never told me this part, but I was really freaking out at the time and they didn't want to make it worse. Off on the side of the road they had spotted multiple figures hiding amongst the bushes and trees. Who knows how many people were actually there, but they guessed at least 2 or 3. What made it scarier was the next 20 minutes left on the deserted road. We all sat there digesting what could have happened. In her words, I don't know what they were planning, but I'm glad we never found out. A number of years ago, I was coming home late at night. I was driving and minding my own business. I had just been seeing a friend. It couldn't have been past 11. And as I was making my way across the road, doing the 15-minute journey back home, do I notice something in the distance? Lights flickering in the sky. Bear in mind, this is the 1980s, and I understand it to be a plane and think nothing more of it. As I continue my journey through the winding countryside, do the lights start to become a bit brighter. I wonder if they're getting closer, which is slightly concerning, but I try to put it to the back of my mind as I'm nearly home. But within a very short amount of time, the lights shoot ever closer towards my direction, until I think they're gone, and finally, I look up and notice that they are above me. It's at this point I just about crap myself. I have no idea what's about to happen. I keep driving, unsure of what to do, and the lights are completely silent, flashing down on my vehicle. I try driving faster, but they noiselessly and effortlessly keep speed. I'm starting to get terrified. What is this? Who are they? What do they want? I drive home as quickly as I can, and just when I'm about to round the corner to pull into our driveway, the lights are gone. I pull up, exit my vehicle, and look out into the sky. I can't see anything. Was it all in my head? I try and hope that it is. I try and dismiss the whole event and forget it ever happened, when a few days later, I'm meeting up with my friend, and he looks at me and is rather pale. I ask him what's up, and he tells me in a confidential tone that something strange happened to him. He says he saw lights in the sky and that they chased him while he was driving. I look at him in incredulity and confess the same thing happened to me. I asked him what noise the thing made, and he said it was completely silent, and it was one of the scariest encounters of his life. Upon realizing we both had the same event, we kept it quiet. We didn't want people to think us crazy. We tried not to speak of it again, but it's always played on my mind, what we really saw and what was following us in our small town. I remember a time I was almost taken when I was a kid. I lived at my grandmother's house out in the middle of nowhere, Texas. Our neighbors lived closer to the main country road, and my grandmother's house was on the back of a 5-acre lot. Across the main street was an army depot. Nothing but woods and yellow daffodils. My parents were at work, and my grandparents were in the house watching the Golden Girls. My father had bought me a bike as a birthday gift. I'd just turned 9, so I was riding my bike up our long driveway. Our neighbor to the left, a really old elderly woman, had no one to visit her or speak to her, so I often played at her house and helped her with anything she asked me to. That day, I wanted to show her my new bike. She was sitting on her porch when I visited her. She had no errands or chores for me, so I talked to her for about 15 minutes and showed her my bike. When I returned to my own driveway, I had been riding back and forth for about 15 minutes, listening to music on my MP3 player, when I had this sudden nauseating pain in my gut. I looked around, only to find a car passing by. I recognized it as my elderly neighbor's car and waved to her. She stopped long enough to talk to me, as she pulled into our driveway just far enough that the tail end of her car wasn't in the street. A white van marked with some electronic company's name and a ladder on the roof passed by. In our area there was only one electricity company. The one on the truck wasn't it, so I found it strange. A good 10 minutes passed when I noticed the van was driving by again and going in the direction it had come from. Perhaps the person was lost, I thought, and kept speaking with my neighbor. She gave me a bag of her garden tomatoes and cucumbers for my grandmother before telling me to head home. I watched her as she drove away. Then that sudden pain returned, and I had forgotten all about it. I looked up to see the white van was driving in my direction, going much faster than it had been. Something inside me screamed to run, to do something, whatever it was, but I had to get away and do it fast. I dropped the bags in my hand and ran across the small pasture to my elderly neighbor's house. She was no longer on the porch, but her house was much closer than my grandmother's. As I hopped over the neighbor's fence, the van sped up as it cut into my neighbor's driveway. I made a quick decision to run up the back steps instead of running around the front of the house. My neighbor had a long wrap around the porch, and her driveway was small. If he had intentions on taking me, it would have been too easy for him to catch me, trying to run around the front of the house. I was in tears as my neighbor locked her door and called the cops. She'd seen everything and called my grandfather first. It would have taken way too long for the police to arrive. My neighbor put me in her room and locked the door behind herself. Moments later, I hear banging on the front door. As terrified as I was, I looked out her bedroom window to find a tall and lean man standing on the front porch. He looked like he might have been in his mid to late 20s. Dark hair, blue jumpsuit like Michael Myers, and he had aviator sunglasses on, and I could see he had a dark beard. He banged on the door once more, then began walking around the house. He was looking in the windows when my grandfather arrived. The very moment he saw him, the man ran back to the van and sped off. I'm 25 now, and thankfully, never saw that van again. Before I was born, my mum would dream about aliens. More specifically, she would usually dream about the spaceships. After I was born, my mum started to dream that the aliens wanted to take me. She would always be upset in the dream, but apparently the people around her would tell her it's okay, she has to go. Fast forward a few years and I'm around 12. My mum wakes up in the middle of the night, feeling like she can't go back to sleep. She goes to the window and stares out of it. I wasn't there, so I can't corroborate this, but she says she saw a light in the sky zip from side to side, making no noise. Then it hovered over the house across the street for a while. Supposedly, it was there long enough for her to wake up my stepdad so he could come and look. He admitted seeing it at the time, but didn't want to talk about it later. He was very no-nonsense, very skeptical. Anyway, it eventually shot up and out of sight. Maybe this is nothing, who knows? So then a few years later, I have the first alien-related dream that I can vividly remember. I was at my grandpa's house in this clearing, staring up at the night sky, waiting for something. Then the sky turns purple, and a massive spaceship comes over the clearing. It's all black, with light coming from windows around the sides of it. I run to my car and the dream ends. Maybe a year after that, I wake up and there were 2 perfectly cut triangles in my sheets. These were brand new flannel sheets I had been given at Christmas. I still keep that sheet because it freaks me out. Maybe there was a flaw in the fabric from the beginning and it just ripped. It felt odd though, especially when I learned that many people report triangular body marks after an abduction. Then the strangest dream happens. I was about 19 or 20 years old. I was walking downtown when all of a sudden I was lifted into the air and my body starts to vibrate violently, kind of like a cartoon character when they get electrocuted. I flew through the air like this for a while, and then I was dropped off back at my porch. I was yelling but no sound came out, and then I looked down at my hand and there was a piece of metal and some wires sticking out. So I ripped it out of my hand and the dream ended. Although there was no specific alien contact in the dreams, I woke up thinking, my goodness, aliens. It felt so real. It was as if I was conscious through the dream. The last odd occurrence was 3 years ago. My mum started dating a guy and they were talking, and one night he said, I think I know what one of your fears is. And my mum was like, okay. And he said, you're afraid your daughter will be abducted by aliens. So my mum is obviously shaken, and he says to not be afraid, that they always bring her back, don't they? My mum, still to this day, has not shared the whole conversation with me. I'm a teenager. Me and my mother live alone. We live basically in the middle of nowhere. The nearest town is less than an hour away, and the only things we have near us are a gas station and a bar. I know everyone who lives near me, and we rarely ever see new people in our neck of the woods, so just seeing someone who isn't familiar is suspicious enough, so this was pretty creepy. A few years ago it was the middle of the night. Me and my mother are night owls. We like to be awake from midnight to 6 a.m., the time most people prefer to sleep. My mother was watching TV in the living room, and I was using the computer in the kitchen. The kitchen and the living room are basically connected, so I wasn't too far away from her, only a few feet. The front door leads right into the living room. It's a door with 9 windows, so it's pretty easy to see into. My mum looked towards the door, and she saw someone staring at her through the window. He was wearing a hood that obscured almost all of his face. My mum jumped, and she of course walked into the door and asked what the hell he was doing. According to my mother, he looked pretty young, but she could barely see his face, so who knew how old he was. The man said something along the lines of, "Can you help me with my car, please?" in a tone I can only describe as miserable and off-putting. Even though it was dark out, there should have been enough light for her to see a car, and there was no car. The man was also holding his pockets pretty tightly. My mother apologized and said no. This caused him to grip whatever was in his pockets tighter still, so tight his arms began to tremble. He stayed for a few more minutes, and then he had swiftly disappeared. Throughout the night, maybe 1 or 2 hours later, we thought we'd hear slight weeping, but we didn't see anyone at any of our doors and windows. I may be making assumptions here, but I can only assume it was a weapon he was holding in his pockets. This was a creepy as hell experience, and it's safe to say he was going to lure my mother out of the house to do something sinister to her. A year ago, there was a very small metal plate jammed between the front door strike plate and the piece that goes inside of it. I'm not sure what it's called. We have zero idea where this metal plate came from, but the metal plate stopped our doors from locking, so I'm assuming it was just put there so that someone could get in. These things are probably unrelated, but it made me think of him, because this was deliberately placed there by someone, and we're not sure why. My mum, my sister-in-law and I are all lying on the ground watching the Perseids meteor shower. I see a plane in the sky, only its lights aren't blinking like they normally would in a plane. Hey guys, I think that might actually be a satellite. And since this is the age of technology and instant answers, my mum pulls out her smartphone, looks up a list of visible satellites passing over our location that night, and it turns out that plane is actually the International Space Station reflecting sunlight back at us, which is totally wicked cool, and there's supposed to be another satellite passing over in about an hour or something. So I'm like, hell yeah, let's find it. But not in so many words since, I'm talking to my mum. Anyway, we continue to watch the meteor shower for the next 15 minutes or whatever, and while keeping an eye out for this next satellite to make its sluggish way across the sky, it hasn't even been a half hour yet, when I swear I see another non-blinking plane-like object in the sky in the general direction of the magic satellite chart. So we're like, okay, maybe it's ahead of schedule, cool. And we're all standing up, walking around to get a better view, because, trees and whatnot. And all 3 of us are staring intently at this satellite, probably not even blinking, when it starts getting bigger, and the sudden realization hits us that it's not getting bigger, it's getting closer. Like, holy hell, it's gonna crash and we're all gonna die. I've never burnt those stupid notebooks from 7th grade. That's gonna be my only legacy. I'm about to ditch my family and book it the hell out of there. My sister-in-law, who is scared out of her mind, of stuff like this and anything that's out of her control is running in circles like in the cartoons. All the while my mum just starts standing there chill as hell when this thing changes its mind and turns the hell around and starts moving away from us and slowly starts to disappear. Minutes later, we saw the satellite we were originally looking for come in from one of the edges of the horizon and disappear over the other. I don't know what the hell that first thing was, but it didn't move fast and direct like a meteor, and it didn't blink or emit noises like a plane. My mum's convinced it was some kind of test flight of a military aircraft, since there's a military camp nearby, and I'm inclined to agree with her, but my sister-in-law swears she felt the air get hot as it moved closer. I did too, and I just chalk it up to adrenaline. When I was 17/18, I was driving home from a friend's house after a movie marathon. It was around 1 a.m. when I left for a decent drive. Not quite halfway, my gas light came on. I had a few creepy catcall experiences at gas stations and was a little paranoid stopping that late in the middle of nowhere as a 110-pound teenage girl. In the end, I think if I wasn't so cautious, I could have been taken or worse. The first gas station I came across was well lit and in a pretty open space. I drove up to the pump and looked around my car mirrors before getting out. As I was starting to pump gas, this normal-looking guy comes out of the gas station shop and starts smoking a cigarette. The pump kept clicking off and not working, so I started messing with it to try to get it to pump. This guy starts watching me laughing. I assumed he was just laughing to himself, watching a teenage girl trying to pump gas, and after getting maybe a quarter of a gallon, I gave up and moved to a new pump. At this point, if I didn't do absolutely everything I did, I would have been screwed. When I got back into my car, I locked my doors just to drive to the other pump. I checked all of my mirrors before getting out and shutting the car off, an old 90s Beetle that didn't always start right away. That's when I saw the guy walking up to my car. He was smiling, walking up to the driver's side window. Not wanting him next to me, I rolled down the passenger window, and he paused for a moment, then smiled to himself and walked to the passenger window. He stuck his head all the way inside my window to talk to me. "Hey, I know this seems really weird. My car broke down, and I need a ride home. It's just a half mile up the road." "Sorry, I don't know you." "Oh, no, I totally get it. I just thought it was pretty weird as I was walking up here. But it's only a half mile up the road and I'm totally stranded. I wish I could help you out, but I really don't know you." "Yeah, I got you. If you had a truck or something, I'd offer a ride in the back." "Sorry, no." All of a sudden he looks pissed. He yanked at my door, but I had locked it. Then he reached for my inside door handle through my window. My car was still running, and I slammed it into first and peeled out as he opened the door. The car taking off slammed it shut, and I sped off and called the police as I got away. They looked at the gas station cameras, and right after I left, he got into his red SUV and drove off. If I hadn't have locked my doors the second time, I would have been screwed. If I'd have let him come to the driver's side window, he would have grabbed me. And if I'd have shut my car off, I wouldn't have been able to drive off in time. If I didn't double check my mirrors, I would have been outside my car when he came up to me. I was about 14 years old when this first thing happened to me. I was home alone during the holidays. I got a few inches of snow where I lived. I was looking out the window and saw deer tracks right by my house. I noticed that they were very close to my house, so I walked outside to check it out. When I first saw the normal deer prints, but as the steps got closer to my house, the strides got longer and longer. Then finally, as I got to the back door, I looked down and saw that the animal tracks looked nothing like an animal, as if it started to walk on two legs. It looked almost as if it were a human footprint that were about the size of mine. I froze and looked around to see the footprints continued around my house until they walked right back into the woods. I've taken a video of what I found, but deleted it because I thought no one would ever believe me, as it was hard to see the prints in the video. I never spoke about it until this next event. This was April 2018. I was 18 years old and woke up at 4 a.m. one night and was very confused as to why. I didn't have a dream that would wake me, and right as I started to fall back asleep, I began to hear this drumming. It sounded like something close to tribal drumming that you hear in old Western movies that's featured in Native Americans. I woke up with fear and rolled away from the window and pulled the covers over my head. I heard it closer and closer to my window. I could hear my brother from the other room yelling for help. My dad comes downstairs trying to figure out what's wrong when I hear him stop mid-sentence to observe the noise. He went right around my house to my brother's window and then just stopped. I went to sleep as soon as it ceased. My eldest brother came up to me the next day and asked me if I heard the drumming, along with my dad and my brother's girlfriend at the time. To add to how creepy the whole thing was, I went outside to investigate what happened, and we saw not only footprints to my window and my brother's, but no indication of where it went once it stopped playing. We also saw by the mailbox that whatever was playing the drums sat down before coming to my window. Now, I knew what a Skinwalker was before the two events happened, and I'm convinced that somehow these two events are related. It was 4 years apart, but I just can't shake the feeling of these two things that happened at my house. One time, I was out in the back with my uncle stargazing. I saw what looked like a shooting star, and I said, "Look." My uncle turned around and missed it, but we saw something else. It was a dark, dim, red, kind of ellipse-shaped object. It moved across the sky at a slightly faster than airplane speed, but slower than a shooting star. At this point, it looked to me like a floating ember. I expected it to fall. It went about halfway across the sky and stopped completely for a whole second, maybe two, and then moved at a right angle to the right, twirled around a bit and shot across the sky to the left. It went really fast. As it reached the other side of the sky, my eyes began to lose focus. "I can't see it anymore," I said. My uncle, who had been following with me all this time, pointed to it further down. I acknowledged it and pointed to it further up. It was doing a loop-de-loop and twists and turns all over that little part of the sky, and then faded away. I would have thought I imagined it had my uncle not been there. He was not just going along with me, because at times he pointed it out, and that's where I saw it. We have ruled out meteorite, shooting stars, planes and birds and such, because they don't come to a dead stop, don't turn so easily at an angle, don't fly erratically, and don't fly at that speed. It was a UFO. Alien or not, it was weird. Later that night, I heard what sounded like a plane flying low over my house, but it sounded unfamiliar, more high-pitched than a usual jet. I looked out and saw lights, but it was a row of red and green and white in a vertical line flying away from me ahead of my house. In my mind, it resembled an aircraft carrier at sea, but they don't fly, right? Especially not where I live. While I believe in life elsewhere, I don't believe they would pay us visits anytime soon. If anyone could offer any explanation, I would appreciate it. About 2 years ago, as a junior in college, I saw something that is quite inexplicable. It was a Friday night, and like most every other weekend, I was driving to my hometown, which was only about a 45-minute trip. It was around midnight when I began to see the general glow of lights from my city as I approached my hometown on the interstate. As I was looking at the glow of my town, 3 vibrant green lights appeared in the night sky, way out in the distance in front of me and well above the city. These 3 lights were equidistantly lined up on top of each other and were strangely vivid. All 3 lights zoomed from about the middle of my field of vision in the car, and then to the left before disappearing. It was only about 2 or 3 seconds, but the lights quite obviously covered quite a bit of distance in a very short amount of time. After seeing this short but quite amazing display, I burst out in a fit of obscenities. I've always been a skeptic towards UFOs or anything paranormal, and have never looked for anything of the sort. But there was no denying that I had seen something wholly mystifying that night that I will never forget. This wasn't a result of some kids shooting a laser pointer in the sky, and the visual display was certainly not from any nearby buildings. I'm completely positive that it wasn't any sort of commercial aircraft due to the fact of the time, and because I was living in rural Arkansas at the time. It's very hard to articulate exactly what I saw that night, and as a result, no one ever shares in my astonishment. It was certainly one of those things where you would have just had to have been there. Oh, and I was definitely not under the influence of any drugs. Figured I should just point that out. I live in a rural area, about 30 minutes west of Palm Springs in Southern California. My cousin and I decided to go hike in some hills that are about 20 minutes north of an area called Oak Glen. There was no trail to get back into the hills. We actually had to trespass on a fire camp and follow a stream up towards the hills. We start climbing the hills and reach the peak of a particularly steep hill. I realize we are way away from where I parked the car, and I don't even know where the road is. On top of all that, there is a heavy fog rolling in, and we only have about 35 minutes of light left. We attempt to take a shortcut down the hill by sliding our butts down a steep slope, and to our dismay, we end up on the side of a 30-foot rock wall. Long story short, we manage to scale down the rock wall, but not before a football-sized rock falls on my cousin's head, and he starts bleeding pretty badly and is heavily disoriented. We walk in the direction we think the car is in. The fog is heavy all around us now, and we're not sure if we're going the right way. My cousin is bleeding from his head, when all of a sudden we come across a long 40-foot building with thick concrete walls set mostly below ground level, like a bunker in the middle of a forest. The windows had bars on them, and the door was heavy steel. My cousin wanted to check it out, but I was getting a total bad vibe from it. He was saying something was drawing him to it. I don't really believe in the supernatural, but I wouldn't let him go in. Just a super eerie feeling. Shortly after we passed the house, the fog let up a bit, and we luckily stumbled onto a foot trail. Weird note. We went back a few weeks later during full daylight and looked for the place, but seriously couldn't find it again. We hiked around there for hours. My wallet also fell out my back pocket when we were sliding down the hill, back when we were far from any trails. My ID showed up in the mail a week later in an envelope with no note or sending address. What I am about to share is something that occurred to me when I was young, around 7. I'm 21 now, and I still have no idea what I saw. Me and my mum stayed in my uncle's house when we went to Mexico, and during the daytime, it was nothing close to scary. The room we stayed in had a window that covered the entire back wall, so when we opened the curtains, we had a clear view of the road and the woods behind the house. It was around 10 p.m. when I was in bed ready to go to sleep. Suddenly I had the urge to look out the window. I looked up and back out the window because obviously I was laying down, so my head was tilted. I saw 5 lights, all different colors, circling the neighbor's house and the woods behind us. In Mexico, there are what my mum called witches or lechuzas, but I don't think that's what they were. I also don't think it was aliens or a UFO. They all had their own motion and speed, they weren't synchronized. I woke up my mum and she saw them as well. She told me to go close the curtains and ignore it. Well, when she was asleep, I decided to get up and open the door, which was on the opposite side of the window facing the front of the house. As soon as I opened it, I saw another light. It was right in front of me. It was not close, but it was straight ahead and appeared to be hovering only a few feet above the ground. It was glowing a yellowish orange. I closed the door, of course, scared as hell, and I stared at it from behind the door. I stayed there for a solid 5 minutes, and then the light slowly dimmed out. I have no clue what I experienced that night. Has anyone else gone through something similar? What was it that I saw? When I was in high school, I had a dream one night where I was driving with my parents down an old back road in the middle of the night. A star fell from the sky and landed in an open field where I was overcome with a bright white light. Next thing I remember, I was on a cold, very hard metal table with 2 grey humanoid-looking creatures standing over me. Here's the thing I remember so vividly. I could see the reflection of the lights in their huge black eyes. The one on my right said something in these click sounds to the humanoid on my left, and they looked at each other. They were wearing white lab coats. I was in a huge white room, overhead lighting seeming to come from nowhere. An ear-splitting scream came from my right shoulder. When I turned and looked, there was a woman who looked like she'd just given birth and blood was everywhere. I did not see the child she birthed. There was another humanoid creature in the way. For some reason or another, I don't know if I was told telepathically or if it was just a sense of knowing and understanding, but I knew I was next to give birth. Keep in my mind I'm a 16-year-old virgin from high school. Never even kissed a boy, should not be pregnant in any way, shape or form. I then woke up. Nothing weird about my day. I go to school, but in my last period, I heard this girl telling her friend that last night she saw a star fall from the sky and explode in a white light. I just about crapped myself right there and then. I still have no explanation for what happened. I'm used to going on long drives by myself, and whenever I'm down I take my bike and ride far away from the city to the outskirts, but if it's dark, I feel safer to take the car. One night I was driving in a very secluded area with lots of trees and bushes. There were no lights or anything, and the road was very narrow. This wasn't the highway or anything, just a road leading to a secluded outskirt of forest. As I continued driving slowly, I noticed 3 men approach me from the opposite direction on a single bike. When I got closer, they stopped and tried to block the road. Initially, they were signaling me to stop the car, but later one of the guys stood in the middle of the road. I noticed he had some sort of stick or weapon. I pressed the accelerator as hard as I could and drove on the bushes and escaped from them. I don't know what they were doing in the middle of nowhere and why they carried weapons. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd have stopped my car. Turns out there had been a murder in the area, and a body was buried, and a case is being investigated. I'm not entirely sure if that's connected to mine. Let me take you back 5 months, when the whole Storm Area 51 craze was happening. It was on the news, and I was sitting there with my grandma. Unbothered, she looks at me and goes, "You know, aliens landed on our local beach in the 70s. They keep their ship hidden under the sand. That's why we haven't had a hurricane since. Now listen, y'all, my grandma is very old school, conservative, religious, and doesn't even joke around. When she said this, I thought she was joking. But she went back to watching the news like she hadn't said anything. And for context, my aunt is one of my neighbors. Later, when I went to check my mail, I saw my aunt sitting on her lawn and went to tell her what Grandma said. Again, unbothered, my aunt goes, "Yeah, that's true. That's why part of the beach is sectioned off." I thought for sure this was some kind of elaborate prank. But later I saw another neighbor and told them the craziness, and they agreed. I looked it up and there were a bunch of news stories from the town claiming that the major reason storms won't hit my area, even though we're in a high-risk zone for hurricanes, is because of the aliens protecting their ship. This happened a few years ago when I was mountain walking. We started as a large group, but after some time of everyone choosing their own pace, I ended up walking by myself. I was walking downhill through a thick forest area when I slipped on an unstable part of the trail, and I slid on my butt to where the path goes straight. Before I could get up, a deer walks out of the trees on my left and stands in front of me. This was not natural, because deers usually avoid human contact. Something was really off about this deer, and I wasn't sure what it was. Its eyes looked lifeless, and its aura was that of unease. Then it opened its mouth to show multiple rows of what looked like razor-sharp teeth, and made an ear-shattering scream. It sounded like nothing I had ever heard before or since. It sounded unreal, like it shouldn't exist. I watched quite a lot of horror movies, and I'm yet to come across a scream this demonic. After the scream ended, it closed its jaw and walked away to the other side of the woods. I never told this story to anyone before. I've heard the stories of other mountain walkers, and anyone who shares stories like this gets labeled as insane. But I know what I saw. Hell, I can't forget, no matter how much I try, and it still gives me a shiver to this day. Last night, my fiancé and I saw something so weird. We were driving to Charlotte from Florida. We passed by some town, I think it was York, and we were on the interstate. We noticed something that looked like 3 streetlights, kind of in a triangle form. However, we didn't see the pole. It was in a construction zone, so I expected it to be just random construction stuff. We were driving for maybe 5 minutes and we never actually got closer to the lights. I was keeping a close eye on them because it had now caught my attention. A fast light came from the left of the sky that was kind of smaller, zooming across, and then a 90-degree angle swooped down right in front of the 3 lights. Then the furthest light, on the end, suddenly got 3 times its original size and dissolved, aka got super small all of a sudden while zooming to the top and right of the sky. The 2 were still there, but then faded and zooped to the top left of the sky. I can't really understand what I saw, but I swear on my life I've never seen any plane go as fast as they went, and the angles that they zoomed at so sharply.